if all women think that they have to offer is their body and their sexuality, that is oppression. And that is the complete opposite, I think, of what feminism, at least originally, was seeking to promote.
Now, I know you asked me a question, and I think I took us way off the path. So I forget what the question was again.
So basically, I was just looking for your thoughts on that text message and,
yes,
you know,
yes.
whether these comments of him being disgusting and abusive and
Right.
so on and so forth are warranted within that context.
Right. So that's what the whole projection. Yes. So people who, let's say, have a dim or a negative impression of men see this as he's being misogynistic, abusive, and so on. And people who have that type of impression probably, unfortunately, have a history of being abused, whether it's by, current partners or whether by, a family member or whatever the case may be, or peers when they were younger. So yes, they all assume it must be this. And what people have to do, that's going back to the, being humble. Okay, is recognizing our personal biases. We can't help it. And there's a term called schema or schemata for plural. And there's also scripts. The idea is, and this is so important for people to understand, I do this in class all the time. I show students experientially. I say, we can't help it. So if I say dog, right now, as soon as I say dog, every person who hears that unconsciously, they have no control. Suddenly there's a whole bunch of neural networks, and they might see a dog. They might think golden retriever or poodle, whatever. Okay. They have thoughts around that. They if they love dogs, they might feel good hearing the word dog. If they had a bad experience, they might have a reflexive physiological response. That's all schema. So basically it's what we think of things, without even, without control. So as soon as someone says, like boundaries, or as soon as he says, don't put your pictures online, whatever the case may be, everyone who saw that unconsciously, automatically had a whole bunch of schemata networks lit up, right? And they saw it through their own subjective idiosyncratic lens, and they made all these assumptions. And again, all of us, you, me, everybody else, we had the initial reaction. Okay. And I knew what I thought initially, but then I stopped and said, wait. As a critical thinker, I want to look at all the evidence. I want to get all sides, like I can. For example, for some people, their first response was, or their first reaction was, how dare she post all this stuff publicly? These are private messages, right? So they only looked at that. And I said, look, quite frankly, I was honest. From the first time I saw Jonah Hill, or not for the first time, because I liked him in Superbad, but after that, in a bunch of movies, I thought he was really, really funny. But my personal, completely biased, completely subjective, I didn't analyze him. I've never spoken to him, but I had certain impressions of him, and they were negative. So I could believe that he could be certain things. That was my bias. Again, I'm humble enough to know that that's my first reaction, but I don't act on it. I contain it. I go, okay, that's my bias. Let me try everything in my power to look at the opposite of that. What would be the evidence, or is there evidence that he's not acting in this way, or he's not manifesting these traits that I imagine him to have? And then the other bias that I have is, and people might not like to hear it, but this is a fact. And he even talked about it in that movie that he did with his psychiatrist, was Stutz, I think, or Stultz. Okay. This is such a cliche, but the fact is, and I can't remember how much he said it in the documentary or in the movie, because I saw it a little while ago. But he was a fat kid. And I say this to people all the time, it's such a cliche, but if you see somebody present, whether male or female, and let's say they're fit, they're successful, they're very attractive, they have everything, right? But they don't act in line with what our biases tell us we think that they should be acting, right? Attractive people, we know, they get special treatment, consideration. They're seen a different way, and they often have a certain manner about them. And if you see someone who in the present does not act in that way, in almost every single case, there's something about, if not every case, there's something about their history that they didn't see themselves in that light. And in many cases, it was that they were, let's say, overweight as a child, because I don't care what happens as an adult. If as a kid, you're picked on, teased, bullied, whether by your peers or you're looked at differently by your teachers or your parents shamed you, right? You carry that. So no matter what happens on the outside, no matter how much success you attain as an adult, if you haven't addressed those long-standing childhood, whether it's traumas or adverse events, they are still running in the background. Those are those are the schema that are affecting everything that you do. So I thought Jonah Hill, as a quote unquote a fat kid, and he'd been he's been very public about his weight, not just as a kid, but as an adult, up and down. I could see him as being insecure. I could see him as being, if he's with a woman, being afraid that somebody else is going to take her and so on. Maybe that happened when he was younger. I don't know. So again,
Mm-hmm.
I knew that those biases were in the back of my mind, and I said, "Whoa, I recognize them." But I'm not going to let those, dictate how I perceive this. I know that they're there. Now I'm going to look for other information. I'm going to absorb as much as I can to get a better picture of all of this. And 99.99 to the last 9% of people did not do any of what I'm describing now. They just went with their gut. They projected their own experiences, et cetera,
Mm-hmm.
onto this. And once again, it was an inkblot test. So I think I might have answered the question somewhere there.
Yeah, and I agree, and I will say I looked at it through a similar lens, and other than a couple of movies here and there, I didn't know much about the guy or his history. I did watch that movie with his psychiatrist, but I would say that's the extent of my knowledge of him. So I can certainly see, where those boundaries arose from. But I take issue with two things as far as the responses out there. So there was a show that I was watching, and it was a group of women discussing it, and they kind of removed the focus from Jonah Hill specifically, and we're talking about raising their daughters. And they said, this is a learning experience for our daughters, that if any man ever speaks to them this way, that's a red flag and they should run away. I really kind of paused when I was listening to this, because again, looking at this through the lens of a therapist, this text message in and of itself, without bringing in any of anyone's own baggage or anyone's own opinion of Jonah Hill, in and of itself, this seems like a pretty healthy boundary that he set, and a pretty healthy expectation. But for these women to go so far as to call this abusive, first of all, I can see where they're inserting their own biases for sure. But what message are we sending to women and men, frankly, that they're not entitled to have standards and boundaries?
Right. And this, we talked, I think you said earlier, we might have talked about it before, but it's a weaponization of psychology. They were saying that he's using this nice language. So basically what psychology taught him, because they were going to couples therapy, how dare he take what he learned from the therapist and to turn it around and to weaponize it. So boundaries, which are a good thing, he wasn't setting boundaries. He's using the word boundary to mask his control and his abuse, right? And then they said, aha, and that's evidence that he's abusive because he did that, which is crazy. It's so unfair. Yes, now, but here's the thing. Would an abusive person say what he said? Yes. But just because an abusive person would say it does not mean that all people who say it are abusive. Do abusive people eat Cheerios? Yes. But if you're eating Cheerios, it doesn't mean you're abusive. That's a logical fallacy. And that's what so many people did. And they started psychoanalyzing him, and he must have been like this in therapy. And how, again, once again, they were saying that he's weaponizing therapy. And by the way, so many people commented and said, the way he described it, he said he was so polite and respectful, right? And saying, as you say, that you read it out. And look, if these boundaries don't work for you, then I'm not the man for you, or I'm not the person for you. And all the best. Have a great life and everything. And again, so many people are opining with their great knowledge, of course, completely devoid of any humility. 1 second, please. Right. That again, all of this is a ruse. Of course, he's trying to sound nice. He's gaslighting her. He's trying to make it seem like he's the good guy. And so no matter what he does, and you and I have talked about this with wokeism and so on. I'm not saying that only woke people did this, because people from all over the spectrum misinterpreted it. But the point is that anything good that he might have said or done, instead of saying, well, maybe we might have to take that into consideration, and maybe that means there's more to the story. They were assuming that everything he said or did was a sign. It was evidence, not a sign. Sorry, it was proof that he's a bad guy, right? Just ridiculous. And by the way, once again, for all we know, he could be terrible. And I know a whole bunch of more messages were released. Okay. She showed a long history and certain stuff. Like I can see him playing the victim in certain times and everything like that. Like neither person is perfect, but this was like
Mhm.
the Johnny Depp Amber Heard trial, which, garnered so much attention. There were no good guys in that. If anyone thought that either of them conducted themselves properly, then I don't know what you're watching. Okay. Johnny Depp, yes. Was he a victim of abuse? Yes, he was. Was he sometimes abusive toward her verbally and so on, or psychologically, maybe? It seems like it to some degree. Two people recording all the time, not healthy, right? But people didn't see that. So many people, some people did, but most people saw it just through one lens or the other, this black or white thinking. And we know that black and white thinking is one of the worst and the most
Yeah.
common cognitive distortions.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I want to drill down a little bit more as far as, outside of the specifics of their relationship, the message that this is sending to people who are seeking out relationships right now, young males and females who are, looking to the media for examples of, how to conduct themselves. So I want to talk a lot more about standards and boundaries within the context of, the modern woman. And I may be focusing a little bit on heterosexual relationships, but I think that this can apply across the board. It seems that I'm choosing my words carefully, as I often do. It seems that the take on this from the modern feminist is women should be able to do what they want, conduct themselves as they want on the internet without consequence. And any man who takes issue with it is an abusive a-hole, basically. And as a woman and as a mother of a young man, I really take issue with that from both sides, because men should have standards, period. I don't think that there's anything wrong with that. And those standards should be articulated and set out from the onset of the relationship. But there's a real issue with this liberation and this hypersexualization of women on the internet, and thinking that that's okay. What are your thoughts on that?
So, for people who don't know, my catchphrase is I was raised in a sex store. My mother opened up Ontario's first sex store, and one of Canada's first sex stores, Lovecraft, in 1972, January 1972, with her female business partner. My mother, for all her flaws, I use her as a role model for my three daughters. And so again, and I've taught human sexuality for over 20 years, about 100 times. So I am the last person who can be considered prudish, okay, overly conservative or anything like that. So again, because you and I come from very different backgrounds,
Yeah.
yet standards are standards. And let's say liberation, sorry, supposed ostensible liberation, which is really something else, is going to be harmful. If you're doing
Mm-hmm.
something thinking it means one thing, but in reality, we know that it could mean something else or can have an impact and so on. Okay. It doesn't matter where you're coming from. Truth is truth, truth with a capital T. Facts are facts. So, what do I think about that? Again, the reason I'm saying this all is that this preamble is that what I'm about to say is what you're going to hear from right wing conservative
Yeah.
commentators. Right. And anyone who knows me knows I am not conservative. I may be fiscally conservative, but liberally, I am more so, or sorry, socially, sorry, I am
Right.
more liberal than almost anybody you're going to meet.
Yeah.
But again, I've seen the damage. And so what do I think about it? I think that I'm all for female empowerment, whether it's personal, interpersonal, social, sexual, right? For true empowerment. I'm going to say a few things that might sound a bit raunchy, but this is so important, okay? And I say, whether it's pornographers, whether it's feminists, all right, that one of the greatest lies that they have taught young women is what you described, is being hyper or overly sexualized is empowering.
Mm-hmm.
It is not empowering. Now, for some people, it is. Okay. There are some women who, and I know them well enough where I can say, yeah, you truly are sexually empowered. You know what you want. You're getting it. You're doing it in a healthy manner. It's rewarding. It's fulfilling. It's enjoyable. It doesn't come at a cost, or whatever cost is. It's a cost that any other person would experience, right? The benefits far outweigh the cost. And if you truly are empowered, then great. Pardon the pun, but all the power to you. I'm happy for that. But far, far, far more people have thought they were empowered, and they come to look later on, years later, to say, what the hell was I thinking? And I'm going to give the example I've given. And again, I don't want to be too crude. I'll be mindful with my words here. But let's just say I have had very many young women. And by the way, I should just say a couple of things. One, not just through therapy, not just through having taught thousands, many thousands of students, okay, of all ages. Just so people know, my program has not just university age students, but people of all ages, professionals returning, and so on. And every term, I have students write a reflection paper. So I've read, I don't know, maybe over 10,000 reflection papers. So I've got more data than most people. Again, in addition to all my interactions in therapy and outside. Okay. So I'm going to say this is such a common refrain. And I'm just going to use one example as an exemplar, but please understand this happens all the time in different variations. So I've had, so I'll use, again, I'll use one woman, but she represents many people. So she was saying, let's say she's in her mid 20s, and she's saying, you know what, when I was in junior high school, like when I was 12, 13 years old, and again, I'll use my language carefully, I was pleasuring boys orally. Okay. She said, I thought I was so empowered. I was in control. I could do what I want. I enjoyed it. And, she said, I thought that. Then she realized, wait a second. What did I get out of this? They weren't doing anything for me. Okay. When my boyfriend is telling me, yeah, if you really love me, you're going to do what you did for me to my 5 friends, and they're going to record it. Okay. And she did. But in that time, for someone to say, oh my gosh, this person I think I love, yeah, you're 12, 13, whatever. Okay. But for this person I think who I love is my partner, I respect, whatever. Okay. Could be doing such terrible things to me. That creates such cognitive dissonance. It just doesn't match. Those two thoughts don't match. So you have to lie to yourself. You have to rationalize. You have to make excuses for what you're doing. And that's what they're doing. And in therapy, when you have this is a true safe space, when you're feeling that whatever you say is not being judged by the other person, and it's and that person is trying his or her best to really get me to understand where I'm coming from. They're trying to be empathetic, right? I'm not judging that person. I might have my own thoughts, but I'm not expressing that. I'm asking questions, and I'll tell my opinion, right, and so on. But anyway, the point is, when they look back and they go, what the hell was I thinking?
Yeah.
That was disempowering. It was degrading. And it took me many years to realize that that's what I was doing. But because that's an early experience, and because she lied to herself, again, when I say she, I'm talking they, and by they, I mean thousands of people in my own personal experience, many, right? The fact is, when you do something and you frame it a certain way, that's the narrative that you've created. That becomes your reality. And you build upon that, and you build upon that. It takes the bravest, and the strongest willed and strongest minded person to be able to put the brakes and go, whoa, what was I thinking? Right. And I have all the respect for anybody who's able to do that, because that's terrifying, because your self-narrative, the way you see yourself, the way that you think about, what we are, we're not reality devices. We are narratives. We are the narrative that we create. And, and again, and people want to lie to themselves. Now, by the way, we create these narratives, but it doesn't mean that it's real. And if they're so divorced from reality, it can be harmful if you think, again, that you're empowered or that people respect you or whatever. And in reality, everything's the opposite. You're not going to function optimally. So again, I always have respect for people in therapy when they're able to break down those, those defenses and be able to see their reality, like the true reality, the real reality, not the reality that they've created for themselves. And again, I don't know if I've answered your question, but I've sure said a lot.
Well, you've brought up a lot more questions and tangents, so I'm trying to pick where I should go with this. And I guess I'll add in the same preface that by no means do I want to come across as promoting any, religious opinion here or political opinion, likewise fiscally conservative. But as far as social and otherwise, very open-minded, very liberal. But I do think that there is something to be said about the direction, again, that this, what are we, 12th wave feminism? I know we're like 4th or 5th, but it just seems like by the day things are moving forward and getting more and more ridiculous. But what I think we're losing here is what has been proven for generations upon generations, that traditional family values and traditional roles, and I don't mean traditional roles as far as let's be like a 1950s housewife, of course not. I'm a woman with a career and a family, and I think that there's certainly room for a balance of the two. But my point being that this lie has been perpetuated to women that, as you're saying, they think that it's liberating, but in reality it's oppressive. If all women think that they have to offer is their body and their sexuality, that is oppression. And that is the complete opposite, I think, of what feminism, at least originally, was seeking to promote. And this is leading to a number of different things. And, we see this in therapy, we see it in the media, in society in general, that young men don't really know what to do as far as mate selection. And we've spoken about this many times in other episodes, as far as how lost they are, because they're damned if they do and they're damned if they don't. They don't really know, what's okay and what's not okay. Women are out there doing what they're doing, and that's great. But I think we should look at the psychological impact of this too. So women are told, what, go out, have sex with as many men as you want. They talk about, increasing body count, I think is the term that's
Bill
used.
count,
But
yeah.
but when we look at it from the psychological perspective and from the pair bonding biological perspective, the more sexual partners someone has, the less they are going to bond with each subsequent mate. And for obvious reasons, that's going to run people into some pretty big problems when it comes down to settling down, if that's what they choose. But I guess as I'm saying this out loud, maybe that's not what they choose.
Right. And again, it's this black and white thinking that we have to help people kind of disconnect from, which is, so they're saying, well, what are you saying, that we should have like arranged marriages where I don't have any partner, and then, I go with the one person that my parents choose for me, things like that. That's an extreme view. Now, by the way, I brought that up for a reason, because with traditional arranged marriages, I feel sorry for anyone who's put into that, because they had no say in this, and they don't know if the partner, the parents' motives could have been, well, we want, financial stability for ourselves, or
It was a business
what
arrangement.
the business arrangement and so on,
Yeah.
right? But then the more traditional, or sorry, the more modern arranged marriages, it's not that you're forced to see to be with this person, not that you see them for the first time on your wedding day, right? The parents are like matchmakers. And I used to say this to students. I'm going to say two things I've said to students for many years, which is, the one is, I say, if you pick somebody because your the neurological, the chemical reaction that you experienced with them, the passion, the lust in that moment, okay, that's not going to last, and that's not an indicator of anything other than a chemical reaction, right? That has far less merit than if your parents did research on this person. They looked, okay, do they have a good education? What's their family background? What's their medical history? Things like that. Do they have ambition? They're choosing the partner based on traits and qualities that are far more predictive of a stable, secure, lasting relationship than what you're doing when when you're drunk and you meet someone in a
Right.
bar and, oh wow, he had a great tongue. So right, so that's one thing. And again, what I'm being very clear is, if your parents impose that person on you, that's not healthy. But if they say, hey, we met this person, check them out. You like them, great. If you don't, hey, we're going to keep looking, right? That's a very different system. The second thing I say, and this is something to what you're saying earlier, and I want people to think about this question, because again, I've asked thousands of women this question. So what I said, imagine that you are, let's say you have a partner, whether so you have two choices, a long-term partner and a one-night stand. Okay. And I say, imagine that they do something sexually that you don't find pleasurable. Maybe it's even a bit annoying, maybe a tiny bit painful. Okay. It's tolerable, but all right. But it's definitely not giving you any pleasure. Okay. And I said, so in the long term case, you've been with this person for years and they've done this to you. This is their go to move for years. And you've always, like, you've pretended it was something that you enjoyed. Okay. And with a one night stand, it's the first time that they're doing this and it's not enjoyable. Okay. So I asked them, I say, in which case are you more likely to say, hey, like in a nice way, you know what, that's not really my thing here. If you do this or that, like, okay. So I've asked so many people, what do you think is the common response? First of all, which one would they be more inclined to actually say something? And then second, their reasoning. What do you think? Hey,
Well,
sorry to put you on the spot now.
I was going to say, based on what we talked about before, I'm going to insert my own biases here. I don't think that the one night stand option is the desirable one.
You mean to tell the person, like, you just put up with it?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So they actually say that, yeah. So I'm trying to think what their most common answer was. So yeah, a lot of people, they would say that they would tell the long-term partner. Okay. And I'll tell you why. I'm going to ask you about the one night stand in a second. Why not? Okay. Other people go, oh my God, how do you tell a partner after so many years? If it's a one night stand, you can say it and, might be a bit uncomfortable. Maybe they're going to stop and then maybe they'll leave, whatever, but there's nothing invested. With a long-term partner, how do you say, honey, you know what? I know for the last 5 years, I told you that it was really good, but I get that's really, really difficult. But many people go that route. Not because they're thinking about that, but they're thinking more about the discomfort or the awkwardness or whatever of the one night stand. But here's the thing. Forget about the discomfort, all that other stuff. Do you know what virtually every woman in this case, and I'm going to point out one of my favorite students' reactions years ago. Okay, but I'm going to ask you, what do you think they say when it comes to the one night stand? Why they wouldn't say anything?
My first thought is they don't want to hurt their feelings, but I don't think that really comes into play based on what you just said there.
Yeah.
They don't want to make themselves look bad, perhaps.
Okay, maybe. All right. I'm going to tell you, it's much more pragmatic than that.
Okay.
Right. And their reasoning, again, I just want people to think about this. Okay. And again, I've heard this from so many people, but again, I'll tell you the one story in class years ago. So they almost all say the same thing. They go, look, you know what? I'll just, it's just not worth it. Okay. Pragmatically speaking, I don't really I don't care about this person. I'm never going to see them again. Right.
So it's
So
not
just
worth
let
the
them do.
discussion.
It's not worth the discussion.
Okay.
I just want to go with the flow. And there may be a sense of awkwardness. It might be a bit of discomfort. Like there's a whole bunch of other layers because
Yeah.
everyone's different. Right. But the most overt statement that they all make is it's just not worth it. Right. It's just one time. I'll just, bite my tongue, let them do it, whatever. Hope they get it over with quickly. Okay. Then they can roll over and we can just go to bed or I'll leave or whatever. Okay. So that's what they say. Again, pragmatically, that makes sense. But so one time these students were saying that, and all these women were agreeing, and these were older women, like older in the sense of it's not 18-year-old students. Okay.
Right.
They were, 30s and so on. And so one student, he was in his, I think, 40s, and he was a gay man. Okay. And he just, again, he said it. I didn't say, he said, without even putting up his hand, he said, well, wait, he said, he said, what's the purpose of a one night stand? Right. He's like, if it's for sexual gratification or enjoyment, he says, aren't you kind of defeating the purpose? Right. If that's the purpose, why would you go, okay, well, I'll just, let him just do his thing or whatever. Hope it doesn't take too long, and then be done with it. He's like, that makes absolutely no sense. And if you really think about it, it doesn't make sense. A one night stand, right? What is it for? Now, by the way, in reality, people have many different reasons. They very rarely admit the real reason. Right. For some people, it's an ego boost. For some people, they're bored. For some people, they're hoping that it's going to lead to something else. For some people, like they're trying to avoid reality. So this is a distraction. Like there's so many different reasons. Right. But the ostensible reason is, I'm doing it because I'm sexually empowered. I want to have gratification. And well, you're not getting it. And you just admitted that you'd rather just shut up and let the person do it and hope that they're finished quickly. Yeah. So, I mean, again, that's an unhealthy perspective. And they're lying to themselves. That's the problem.
Yeah, and that's kind of where my, I guess, hesitation with my response came from, is because I don't really understand, the point of what people are doing with this and what they're hoping to accomplish, essentially, other than pleasure. But then if it was no good, what the hell was the point?
But to build on what I was saying, in my classes, in human sexuality, in addition to critical thinking, I always teach them critical thinking skills so that no matter what information they might see out there, whether it's online or TV, from friends, or whatever, I say they're able to process it, to analyze, process, and use it effectively. That's critical thinking. But the second thing I say is, I want you to come out of this class truly empowered. Male, female, gay, straight, whatever, I don't care. I said, I want you to be empowered. You don't have to agree with my perspective on things. I'm not trying to change your mind, but I want you to have the ability and to know that you have the right to express your wants, your needs, and so on. And here's what I say to people. I say, if you're a woman and you have sex with all these different people, and you can truly, genuinely say, A, I really find it rewarding. B, I'm not looking to settle down. That's just not my thing. I know for a fact it's not because of trauma. It's not because of any other reason. I honestly, feel better this way or whatever. Okay. Or I'm not ready to. Later on, I will. And I'm prepared for that. Okay. I say, if you can say all those things and then see when you have a random hookup with somebody, or if you have friends with benefits, I say, if you can say on average, no, it's never perfect, but on average, if the sexual or emotional or other gratification that you receive is on par with or more than the other person, then great, you're doing a good job. But if you consistently find yourself just doing everything for the other person, you're only worried about their pleasure or satisfaction or their needs or their demands or whatever, I say that's not empowering. Empowering means that you get what you want in an adaptive way. And as I always say to people, what you say or do is irrelevant. It's what other people see and hear. So you have to find healthy ways, adaptive ways, effective ways to express your needs. And if you feel that you can't do that, just like with these women, who have the one night stand and the guy's doing something they don't like, okay, instead of thinking, well, wait, I'm here for a reason. right? I drove to this hotel, or I met them at the bar, and I took a chance. I went home with them and something like that. Wait, I want to get something out of this. If you don't feel that you're able to communicate what you want or need, then you're not empowered. Don't lie to yourself. And again, even though we're talking about women here, it applies to anybody, right? Man, woman, gay, straight, doesn't matter. If you can't express your needs and wants, do not lie to yourself and say that you're empowered. And that's why I say earlier, that's the greatest lie that has been sold, that all these women, because they're more sexual, or they're watching porn more and so on, that empowers them. No, it does not. I'm going to take this one next step. I don't think I've talked
Yeah.
about this before, but the other great lie is that when they say that, well, young people are having access to porn, we know this, right? At ages that we've never experienced before, right? Well, I did, because I was raised in a sex store, but for everybody else, right? A magazine here or there, that's not the same as every single day going on your phone. And they go, see, well, they're becoming more knowledgeable. They're becoming more savvy. They're becoming more empowered. No, they are not. What they're doing is they're being exposed to things that they don't have the psychological, emotional, cognitive capacity to understand and to process properly. And so let's think about this. I hate to sound like an old man, but if we look at porn, especially, or music videos, most music videos, the kids are watching rap, hip hop, whatever. Okay. What are they seeing? Even in the ones that are by Cardi B or Nicki Minaj, or whatever, where the women are supposedly empowered.
Oh,
Okay.
they're seeing half naked women shaking
You,
around and
for the
being,
gratification of
yeah,
men. That's the
yeah,
script that they are learning. That
yes,
sex is about women subjugating themselves to the man's wants or desires. That they,
yeah,
as you said earlier, all they have to offer is sexuality, their body, not their intelligence, not their thoughts, not their, and so on, right? And so when you see that from the youngest of ages, your schemata and your scripts are being set. And if Jean Piaget talked about this, many, many years ago, in the most famous developmental psychologist, he talked about assimilation and accommodation. So if somebody has a schema or a script, and it's established, okay. So the example I always give people is Santa Claus. If you're not into Santa Claus, choose whatever other analog you can use. But I say, when a young child is taught that Santa Claus exists, great. He believes that's his set belief. Okay, Santa Claus exists, and then when he sees evidence to the contrary, like, wait, I went to a shopping mall. Why did I just see 3 Santas? Right?
mm-hmm.
Well, at first, what the kid does is all this new information, he's going to assimilate it into his pre-existing belief system. So he's going to say, "Oh, well, there's 3 Santas because, well, maybe Santa, if the kid's smart, like, he got cloned, okay, or maybe he has magical powers, or this, or like they. So if a child sees early on a female is to be used as a tool for a man's gratification, whatever, that's their script, and so they get more information. Whatever they see, it gets assimilated into that existing script. The accommodation, you change that script or the schemata, with new information, new knowledge, or whatever. Okay, but that comes later on when you're older, and with something as complex as human sexual interpersonal dynamics. Right, like kids don't just learn that naturally. So unless the child is actually sat down and has it explained to them by a source that they respect, they're going to respect Cardi B far more than any teacher or parent or something
yeah,
like that, right? So the kids, they're not getting any accommodation. They're not changing their model. They're getting new information. They're getting a bit, they're getting more layers of depth and of understanding and in context and everything like that. But they're not having a wholesale shift in their understanding of human dynamics, of sexual dynamics and interpersonal dynamics. They're not getting that. That's not accommodating. It's all being assimilated in the same model of the woman is there for a purpose, and that purpose is not real empowerment. They're being told it's empowerment, but it's really for the other guy's pleasure. It's to be judged, to be not judged negatively. That their value is derived from the gratification, the pleasure that they bring, right? And they never have that, again, that wholesale shift, that accommodation. So that great lie that I said earlier is that having access to, sexual material at an earlier age makes girls or guys more empowered, more savvy, more, capable of getting their needs met. That's BS. It's
mm-hmm.
not true. And again, the more that people think that that's the case, right, the more they're lying to themselves. They're distorting reality, and they're not functioning optimally. You cannot function optimally when you're distorting your reality so grossly. A little bit of distortion, great. A little bit of, maybe optimism that's not warranted, fine. But
Sure.
this is significant. It's a huge distortion. So I hope people understand that. And once again, this is coming from somebody who A, was raised in a sex store. Okay. I've been around sex since the beginning of my life. B, who has taught human sexuality for over 20 years. C, has made this a huge part of my clinical practice. Again, it's all about sexual empowerment. And D, I think I've said this to you before on other podcasts, but if anybody saw or heard a transcript of me talking to my three daughters from the
Yeah.
beginning, from the youngest of ages, they would never know that I'm talking about girls. I mean, except for the content, right? But the message is the same. I want my daughters to be empowered. I want them to know that if something's going wrong, whether it's in a relationship, whether it's in a sexual situation, whether it's at work, whether it's at school, I don't care. I want them to know, not to feel, but to know they have the right to advocate for themselves, to be to have self agency, and to make sure they do their damnedest to make this situation turn out in their favor. It's not always the case, but that they know that they should be trying to do so. And everybody should hope that for their child or for themselves.
Join us for the continuation of this conversation next week on Awake at the Wheel.
As much as we love listening to ourselves speak, especially me, we would love to hear from you as well. So our emails are in the description below. If you would please write to us with your questions, feedback, comments, topics that you'd like us to cover. We can do this together, the two of us, but it's much better if we do it together. So we look forward to hearing from you, and we are going to have a segment called Rounds Table, where we're going to discuss the feedback and the questions and so on from our audience, and we will take it to the next level. We're going to help you be able to deal with some of these issues that you might be bringing us, or it's going to be a topic for us to explore together. And we really look forward to building a community of like-minded people who want to do right by others, not just for themselves.